Good evening. I hope everyone has had a wonderful day, a wonderful start to your week so far. I'm really enjoying all of these different opportunities that we have to get together, these group visits. I'd like to do something a little bit different with this one. I think we have a lot of information to cover, so I'll go through a part of it, and then if anybody has any questions, then I would invite you to ask those in the Q&A function. And then I'll kind of answer those questions as we move through. So each section I'll stop to answer some questions. So tonight we're going to be talking about fasting. I think there's a lot of controversy about medical fasting. I do think that it is something you have to be very careful with. And I don't say that lightly. I think it's important to understand that whenever we are fasting, that if we have any type of metabolic disorder, if we have very low body fat, even if we have emotional disturbances or are going through a period of anxiety or depression in our life, or if we've had dysregulated eating in the past, this is something I would want you to be very, very careful of. So fasting is not something that we should just sort of do willy-nilly. It's something that should be very well thought out and preferably done with a clinician. So hopefully I'll answer some questions tonight and give you a good understanding of the foundations of fasting, and then we'll go from there. So our agenda tonight, we're going to talk about some historical and generational adaptations to fasting, which I think are really important, understanding that our bodies have adapted to fasting depending on where we're located in the world and also seasonally. We'll talk about different types of fasting. We'll also look at the effects of fasting on chronic disease. Then we'll talk about we know that fasting can be great for helping with chronic disease, but what about for those that are pretty healthy? Like, what role can fasting play for them to reach optimal health, optimal wellness, their maximum wellness, so to speak? We'll also look at the effects of fasting on the microbiome and specifically on leaky gut, which we know is a huge issue. We see that rampant. It's in a significant amount of the patients that come to see us. So we'll discuss that. And then we'll also talk about considerations for menstruating women. When you have a cycle of hormones that changes monthly like women do, that's a very particular physiology that needs to be addressed with the individualized care that it deserves. And then we'll wrap it up, and then we'll answer any questions that you have before finishing up for the night. So looking at the past and thinking about how people have thought about fasting in the past, we have a quote here from Plato: "I fast for greater physical and mental efficiency." You know, this is a really interesting quote, right? Because if you've ever done any fasting, you may think that maybe Plato doesn't know what he's talking about after all, right? Because usually when we fast, greater physical and mental efficiency is the last thing that we think. A lot of times we feel weak, we feel tired, we feel foggy-headed. You know, we can't think clearly. And so we think that we need to eat, right? We think that we need sugar. And sometimes you'll even hear a lot of people say, "Oh, my blood sugar is so low, I need to eat." Now, sometimes that's truly the case, especially for diabetics. But for a lot of people, when they've done studies on individuals who feel that way, who feel like they're exhausted, they're tired, they're foggy-headed because they haven't eaten in a while, there actually aren't any biochemical testing that's been done to show that it actually is a blood sugar problem. A lot of times it has more to do with our feedback mechanisms around craving. I was listening to a cardiologist last week give a talk on this topic, and he was talking about how the desire for specific types of food, specifically sugar, highly processed, salty or fatty foods, they have a feedback mechanism that's actually very similar to drugs like cocaine or heroin. And so a lot of times that foggy headedness we feel or that weakness that we feel is actually withdrawal symptoms from these heavily processed or sugary foods that are in our diet. So very much like someone who's going through withdrawal, the best way to correct that is to just keep moving forward. An author I heard a couple of years ago said that we slay the sugar dragon when we fast. And sometimes it feels like that, right? Like we get hangry, we get frustrated. And so in order to slay that dragon, you really just need to push forward. Again, that is to be done hopefully with medical oversight. Then we take a look at this quote from St. Augustine, which was in the 3rd century. He says, fasting cleanses the soul, raises the mind, and subjects one's flesh to the spirit. It's really interesting that fasting is a part of all of the large religious organizations in the world. And specifically in Christianity, there is still a tradition of fasting. I think it's actually kind of interesting. I just looked this up right before because I was a little bit curious, but the Orthodox Christians, they actually tend to fast somewhere between 180 and 200 days, depending on what tradition you're talking about, per year. So I thought that was pretty significant that there was so much of the year where one would actually be fasting. So let's talk a little bit about this historical adaptation. So when we think about location, I want you to kind of look at this map that's here in the background, and you can see right around the equator, sort of like right in through here, you're going to get the most average you can be, right? The temperature doesn't change a whole lot. The length of day doesn't change a whole lot. Things pretty much stay the same. And there is almost always the availability there of fruits and vegetables year round. Whereas if you go up north here, like maybe in Northern Europe, or over here in Russia, in these areas, you're going to have long periods of night, and you're also going to have long periods of time that don't have any fruit. So there would be no natural sugars that you would be able to have, especially I'm thinking about, maybe a couple hundred years ago to thousands of years before that, when our ancestors would have been living in these areas and they would have been very localized, right? So they would not have had the ability to move around the world like we do now. So they would have lived in that one small area their entire life. And over generations, there's an adaptation to your environment. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is like PCOS. So PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, is a disorder that it mostly affects women of Northern European descent. Now, it can affect anyone. So I'm not saying that only women from that area of the world have it, but there is a higher risk of women from that area having PCOS. It's interesting that women with those sets of symptoms, they do really well on a fasting diet. And if you think about how their ancestors would have lived for thousands of years, then they would have had times during the seasons, especially during the long, cold winter, where they didn't have as much access to food. Certainly not fresh fruits and vegetables. So no sugar at all. So they would have ate more of a keto style diet. Also, women with PCOS do really well with more intense exercise. It's really good for helping to balance their hormones. And that makes sense if you think of living in a really rugged environment where survival is going to demand a very rugged lifestyle. So wherever our ancestors have sort of adapted to, then that can kind of help us in determining how our bodies best work. Now, of course, now we live all over the world. We're no longer tribal like we once were. And so there's been a lot of, there's a lot of cross genetics, which is good, right? I mean, diversity is good and it makes us stronger. So it doesn't work for everybody. This is one of the ideas of the blood type diet. I'm not a huge fan of that, but this is one of the reasons why some people get a good benefit from that, is because the blood types tend to be somewhat regional as well. So in a roundabout way, by using a blood type diet, you're sort of taking into consideration where the environment in which your ancestors are adapted to. So we talked about location, we talked about seasons, and then spiritual and religious fasting. And so a big part of spiritual and religious fasting, not only what I had mentioned earlier, but also this idea of community. So doing things together makes it so much easier. And you guys may remember I talked about community. We did one of these group visits on community a couple of months ago, and being in a community that is fasting with you is going to make this a lot easier. So I would encourage you that if you want to learn more about fasting after our time together, I would encourage you to get in a community that's doing that, or maybe get with a few friends, and then you guys being directed by a clinician, by a dietitian, somebody who can really help guide you, that you guys do this together, because it can be really impactful, not only for your physical health, but for your spiritual health and emotional and relational health as well. So before we go into the different types of fasting, does anybody have any questions about those spiritual aspects, emotional aspects, historical aspects of fasting? Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit about different types of fasting. So one of the things I mentioned in Christian tradition, there's fasting, and the earliest Christians fasted in what would be called now a 5 and 2 fasting routine, which would have meant that they fasted on Wednesdays and Fridays. It's so cool to see these connections between our faith tradition of the past and the research that's being done today, and how those things correlate to physical health. That's a special interest of mine. So you've got 5 and 2 fasting, which is where you eat 5 days completely normal, or how you would normally eat. And then you have 2 days that would be 500 to 600 calories per day. Then you also have time feedings. An example would be like what I have on the screen here, 16/8, which would be where you fast for 16 hours. And then you have a feeding window of 8 hours. You could also do 20 hours of fasting and 4 hours of feeding. There are a lot of variations to this. It's really important when you're thinking about fasting that we're considering the stress that we're putting on our bodies. So just like if I was going to go run a marathon, I wouldn't just step out tomorrow and go run 26.2 miles. That would not be a good idea. I probably wouldn't complete it. I would almost certainly injure myself. And it's a similar situation with fasting. So I would encourage you to, let's say right now that you do most of your eating in a 16-hour window, which is pretty normal. People, wake up fairly early. They may have some breakfast, maybe a snack before lunch. They have lunch, maybe a snack after lunch sometime in the afternoon, dinner. And then a lot of times, many of us, we have a snack or second dinner, as we sometimes call it, around 8 or 9 o'clock. So it's actually a fairly large eating window. So let's say that you're currently eating like that. You wouldn't want to just go down to something where you have a 20 hours of fasting or 20 hours of fasting and 4 hours of eating. That could be really hard on the body. So that's going to disrupt your hormones. It's going to cause a lot of fatigue. It's going to cause you to feel exhausted, and it's just going to throw your metabolism for a loop, really affecting your reverse T3, which is one of your thyroid hormones, and causing you to feel almost hypothyroid. So it's a lot better to be in a program or be working with somebody who can help guide you slowly, and you can move into longer and longer fasts, just like we would with exercise. Water fasting is another type of fasting. So water fasting is where you just will drink water and you'll have nothing else. And that could be for a 24-hour period, or it may be for 72 hours or 5, or there's even a 7-hour fast, a 7-day fast, which I definitely would not recommend you doing without some oversight and somebody checking in with you to make sure you're okay. And definitely not something you would do starting out. So the thing about water fasting is that studies have shown that autophagy, that is self-eating, right? So I'll explain that in just a second, because I know that's kind of a strange idea, right? Certainly a strange word. That autophagy occurs in about 48 to 72 hours is when it starts, and then it reaches its peak right about 5 days. So let's talk for a second about autophagy and why that would even matter. Something called self-eating, which sounds like a horrible idea, right? So within our bodies, each individual cell, sometimes there's an issue with the DNA and you have a mutation, or there may be a misfolding of proteins that can occur in the brain. Over time, these cellular mutations can evolve into cancer or into cells that replicate faster than they should, or with incorrectly folded cells in the brain, it can lead to dementia, other types of cognitive decline. So when we start to self-eat, or autophagy, as I said, we actually begin to clean those cells up. So the body goes from one of constant growth, which we do when we're well fed, to one of more conservation and repair. So I think that if you are on a rhythm of fasting, then you're going to be able to heal better. It's going to have a lot of implications that we're actually going to talk about a little further down the line. And then something else that you can do in this whole fasting, in the fasting realm, is called the fasting mimicking diet. So there's some brands you can Google that sell you a whole kit, and you get 5 little boxes, and each box is for 1 day. All of the food comes prepackaged in these little envelopes, and you get tea, and it really makes the whole process not that bad, really, you know, because you're constantly making tea or making yourself this little bit of soup, and so it sort of feels like you're doing a lot, even if you're only consuming about 800 to 1,000 calories in those programs. So fasting mimicking is really about calorie restriction, and most of the good studies we have around intermittent fasting shows that the biggest reason why we see benefit there has to do with the calorie restriction that occurs. You know, if I eat 5 days normally and I eat 2 days where I'm only eating 600 calories, then the net response is that I eat less calories, right? If I fast for 16 hours and only eat 8 hours where I used to eat 12 hours, then the net effect is that I eat less calories. So there's a lot to be said about calorie restriction within the intermittent fasting paradigm. So that's probably the biggest way in which fasting mimicking diets are helpful, is that they get a calorie restrict, which calorie restricting over time also helps with autophagy. It takes a long time though, because most of us, you know, are just by the fact that we are living in a Western civilization, are overfed. So it's going to take a while to adjust that metabolism, to re-regulate the amount of glycogen, which is stored sugar, as well as adipose tissue, that is fat in our bodies, before we can kind of get to a place where eating a calorie restricted diet leads to autophagy. So let's talk about the effects on chronic disease of fasting. And it really is all types of fasting that can help with these. I mean, I think water fasting, of course, is the most extreme. You're going to see the quickest results. And I do think that in a lot of ways, when I'm setting these up for patients, we'll start with a water fast, whether it be for 24 hours or, you know, maybe 48 hours. It just Really depends on the individual. And once we've seen their labs, we may start there and then work into an intermittent fasting routine. But all of these things are going to have an impact on the chronic disease. So the first thing I want to talk about, first chronic disease, is let's talk about liver inflammation. So if we think of the liver, I want you to think of this liver, picture this liver in your mind. Picture this liver as like a sponge. And you've got this like cup of water above the sponge. Now this cup of water represents all of the blood that has absorbed all of the nutrients, all of the toxins, everything from your small intestine. And now it's being guided and focused through these vessels toward your liver. So that's this cup of water that I have above the liver. So I'm going to pour that through this sponge, and it's going to be filtered. Now, a real sponge, a sponge compared to the liver, it doesn't do all the work of the liver, whereas the liver is not only going to filter, but it's also going to rearrange amino acids and specific proteins that we need. It's going to help with detox and changing certain chemical structures so that we can clear those in our kidneys or through our GI tract. So it's going to do a lot more than just a sponge. But for our example, we'll just say that it at least filters like a sponge would. So we pour this water into the sponge, and then out the other side comes this sort of cleansed water or cleansed or filtered blood that's now going to go into the rest of the body, carrying all of the nutrients that we need for our survival. And it's going to go into the brain, it's going to go into the muscles, it's going to go into the heart, and it's going to deliver what we need to thrive. Now let's take that same liver, let's take that same sponge that we're talking about, and let's coat it with bacon grease. Now, if I do that with a real sponge, it's going to be much less effective. Now, we do a similar thing with our liver through something called glycogen. So glycogen is a storage form of sugar, and it's a little closer to a triglyceride. So it's a little more like fat, but not quite. So we will actually store that in our liver, and then we can even change that, like I mentioned, into lipids, into fats themselves, and we're going to store those in our liver. We're also going to store that glycogen. We're going to store that in our muscles so that we are ready. Should our bodies go into a time of fasting or starvation, we are ready to utilize that glycogen, to utilize those fats as a way to survive, as a way to thrive, even in a fasted environment. Remember, this goes back to how we have adapted over generations to actually be able to thrive in a fasted environment, at least part of the year, depending on your location. So whenever we fast, we're going to eat up all of the sugar that's in our blood. So our blood sugar is going to drop. And then the next thing that's going to happen once the blood sugar has gotten pretty low is we're going to convert glycogen into blood sugar. So we're going to take that glycogen and then we're going to turn it into blood sugar. And then we're going to use that blood sugar as energy, or the sugar that's now in the blood as energy. Once we've emptied all of that, we're going to move into another type of metabolism where we're actually burning fat, or we call that ketosis. So all of those processes are going to work to lower the amount of fat, the amount of glycogen in the liver, which is going to decrease liver inflammation, and it's going to decrease fatty liver. And by doing that, we've actually freed up the liver to now do its job of detoxifying. So that's one of the ways that we can reverse chronic disease through fasting, when we focus on what's happening in the liver. So now let's talk about a little bit about diabetes and blood sugar and what happens when we fast there. So I want you to think about your body, your metabolic structure. Think about that as a warehouse. And in this warehouse, you have all of these little wood burning stoves. Now, this is similar to each individual cell in the body. Okay, so each individual cell is like its own wood burning stove. So now I want you to imagine that coming into this warehouse are cardboard boxes. But in our bodies, that's going to be represented by, or those cardboard boxes are going to represent sugar. So let's say that the sugar is coming into these warehouses, or into this warehouse that is our body, through our mouth, and then going down into our GI tract and out into our bloodstream. So now all of these cardboard boxes are supposed to be burnt in the wood stoves, or in the stoves. And the sugar is supposed to be burnt in the individual cells. So the workers, what delivers that sugar, or what delivers those cardboard boxes to the wood burning stoves, is going to be insulin. So insulin combines with glucose, and then it takes it into the cell where it's used and burned as energy. So now I want you to imagine these wood burning stoves are full. They're just jam-packed with cardboard. They've got no more room. Those cells, or those wood stoves, they begin to form kind of like a callus. It's this protective mechanism that prevents more sugar and more insulin, this insulin sugar, insulin glucose complex, from going into the cell. It's trying to protect us, right? Because it doesn't understand why the sugar just keeps coming. So that protective mechanism is called insulin resistance. And you may have heard of that before, right? Because insulin resistance is what leads to diabetes. You know, it's so interesting how we can sense this. So I can't tell you how many times that I've had patients who, will change up their diet, and they'll be like, oh, I can't eat anything sweet on here. Like, there's nothing sugary or nothing sweet. I'll say, well, we do have apples, there are bananas that are included in the food plan when we're talking about a whole food style diet. And they'll say, apples don't taste sweet to me. And okay, that's, it's a good, like, take note of that. And then the patients will go into their life, and they will take within the food plan all the information that we've given them, and they're ready to make some changes. And then they come back at that 1 month visit, or at that 3 month visit, just depending on their individual needs. And we review their labs. Those patients who have really stuck with it, they are so excited, and they'll say things like, I finally taste an apple again. See, because as we lose that insulin resistance, and as our cells become more sensitive to sugar, our taste buds become more sensitive to sugar. And we're finally able to taste fruit as we've always hoped we would, as it's been designed for us to taste. So whenever we fast, then we create an insulin sensitivity in our cells. See, because we burn up all of the sugar that's in the cells, just like all of the cardboard that I mentioned, and then we burn up the glycogen that was there, and we start to burn fat, and our body now is very sensitive to sugar, knowing that if it gets any little bit of sugar, it's going to be ready to burn it. So we can effectively reverse diabetes and prediabetes and insulin resistance. And I think that this is amazing. I mean, this is something that a few years ago in conventional medicine, they would have thought you were crazy if you would say that you could reverse diabetes. The truth is that it is very difficult to do. It's hard to change these lifelong patterns of coping when we've used food for emotional support. It is very, very difficult. And I'm not taking any of that away. And that's why I think it's so important that you do this in partnership on a journey with a clinician who understands your individualized story. But we can do it. And it is really exciting when we see a patient who's been able to reverse their diabetes through nutrition. So let's talk a little bit about cholesterol, right? So we talked about how when we fast, right, we burn through sugar, we burn through glycogen, and then we start to burn fat. Cholesterol is a type of fat. So fasting can help us lower cholesterol. It is interesting, though, that not all fasting works the same when it comes to lowering cholesterol. I've had quite a few patients who would do intermittent fasting, but they actually weren't decreasing the amount of food that they would eat. They'd still eat the same amount of calories. They would just eat them in 8 hours instead of 16 hours. And they would lose weight, and many of them would feel better, but their cholesterol doesn't always go down. So it is important to think about the types of food that we're eating. And I don't necessarily mean cutting out eggs or cutting out, red meat. But I think we have to take an individualized approach when it comes to cholesterol and think about how does your specific body, how does it make cholesterol, or how is it storing it from the food you eat? And then once we understand the answers to those questions, then we're able to tease out the best plan, the best individualized plan to help you lower your cholesterol. And of course, by lowering cholesterol, by lowering inflammation, like we talked about in the liver, then now we're decreasing risk for cardiovascular disease, which means less heart attacks. It's really exciting to think that we have control over our body's health. We can make decisions. We can set up rhythms of health in our life that are going to make a difference in our long-term health and whether or not we have to deal with chronic disease. So some chronic disease in our community is very scary. When we mention words like cancer or dementia, it automatically raises the emotional threshold, right? And I'm not saying that if you fast, you'll never get cancer. And I'm certainly not saying that if you have cancer, that you should just fast instead of have that taken care of. I'm certainly not saying that you will absolutely prevent dementia with fasting or that you can reverse it, which we know is very, very difficult. But I am saying that the studies are clear that fasting can reduce our risk. Straightforward, if you think about it. So if we consider that once we convert over into autophagy, that is self-eating, remember eating those cells that are misshapen or that have mutated DNA. Once we've been able to convert over into that type of metabolism, then any cells that could become cancer are going to be more likely destroyed by our body's own immune system. Any cells, any neurons that may be misshapen in the brain that could eventually lead to dementia, once they reach a critical mass, they are more likely going to be destroyed when we convert over into autophagy. So I think that more research needs to be done, but the studies that we have now are clear that fasting can certainly change the outcome of our health long term in many different ways. So let's talk about the role of fasting in optimal health. So what if you don't have any chronic disease? Well, if we don't have any chronic disease and we're doing well in the body. If you remember a few slides ago, I discussed that fasting is a type of stressor on the body. It actually introduces inflammation into the body, right? Anytime that we're going to be changing the way that our body metabolizes for energy, then we're creating a stressor. As long as that stress is dosed appropriately, then we're going to add resilience into the body. So there are a lot of different things that work on this principle. I mentioned running for a marathon earlier. So that's one way. I mean, we can't start out running a marathon, but if I start out today running 1 mile, and then every other day, I give myself plenty of rest and make sure that I'm eating, drinking water, and sleeping well, then I know that over time, I will eventually be able to run a marathon because my body has become more resilient against that type of stress. We also see this in weightlifting, right? So if I want to deadlift 350 pounds, I'm not going to go to the Y tomorrow morning and just grab that weight and pick it straight up. I'm probably going to throw out my back and maybe even rip some joints apart. So it's not something I recommend. But if I start out lifting lightweight and then gradually increasing, then I'm building resiliency and strength in my muscles. Fasting is a way to build resiliency and strength into our metabolic muscles. It is a way to stave off a lot of these chronic diseases that we've talked about. It's a way to preserve our cognition. There is a whole fleet of people. You could almost call it a cult because they're very, very dedicated, but caloric restriction and longevity. There's been tons of studies that show that caloric restriction can lead to longevity. You've probably heard me talk about the blue zones before in some of these talks. And it's very interesting to me that in these blue zones, people tend to just naturally, as part of their culture, they tend to have caloric restriction as part of the way they eat. And as a result, at least part of the result, is that they live longer and they live healthier. So it is going to increase our physical health if we do fasting correctly and we do it in a way that is helpful. One warning that just comes to mind considering fasting is when it's time to refeed. So when we're going to be refeeding, we want to make sure that we are not, we want to make sure that we're just not eating a lot of sugar or eating a lot of processed foods, because those things are going to spike our sugar and they can start to cause metabolic damage right away. So you want to make sure that when it's time to refeed, that depending on the program, depending on what you've been doing, that you're doing that appropriately. So let's talk for a second on changes to the microbiome. So it makes sense, right? It makes sense that if I change what the flora in my GI tract are eating, then I'm going to change them. Now, what's so cool is that these microorganisms that are down inside of our small intestine, they're very, very, very small. And that means that they are at risk for injury very quickly. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes that's a bad thing. So the healthier gut bacteria that we have, they tend to be more resilient to fasting. A lot of it has to do with the generational adaptation and the bacteria that have been cultured in us that we receive from our parents and from our families and from our communities, and that have been the same and have been brought forward over generations. So that healthy bacteria is more likely to thrive during a fasting event. There was one study that showed that with a little bit of fasting, they were able to change the microbiome, and they seen a drop in blood pressure associated with that. There was another study, a very recent study, that showed that you can reduce the infectious burden of salmonella through fasting. So now the next study that they're going to be looking at is going to be whether you can actually use it as a treatment, which I think is pretty cool. It's pretty exciting. Then also leaky gut. So fasting is going to lower inflammation in the small intestine, and the intestinal cells, they have a 2 to 7 day life cycle, which means that they can heal pretty quickly if we just give them a break, if we just give them some time to heal. And fasting allows for that. Fasting also restores the integrity of that connection between the cells, and it reduces the permeability so that you've got less leaky gut, you've got less of those whole proteins and toxins and infectious particles leaking over into our bloodstream. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of changes that occur down inside the small intestine when we fast. So it's not just about what's happening to our muscles, what's happening to our liver, what's happening to our brain or our heart, but it's also about what's happening in the GI tract itself. So one of the things that I want to mention before we wrap up is considerations for menstruating women. I think that women's health is extremely important, and it's much, much different than the average man's health or the health of a postmenopausal woman. So women who are still menstruating, they have a hormonal cycle, right? We all know that. We know that there's a rhythm to their hormones. And that means that there should also be a healthy rhythm to the way we fast, to the way we feed, to the way we exercise. So during the follicular phase, that is the part during your period, you want to take it easy at first, and then start ramping it up after about day 3 back into fasting and exercise. During the ovulatory phase, during that period that's before or like while you're ovulating, the release of the egg, this is where you're going to have higher energy. This is where you're going to have higher levels of hormones. You're going to be able to do longer fasts here, and more exercise is okay. But you still have to be careful. Pushing yourself too hard, introducing too much stress or inflammation into the system at any point during this monthly rhythm is going to cause us to have a decrease in resiliency, not an increase, which is the opposite of what we want. And then during the luteal phase, which is just before menstruation, this is about a week before your period starts, You want to be doing either light fasting or none at all. You want your exercise to be more restorative. This is where you'd want to do more yoga. You'd want to really make sure that you're tending to your body well. And in doing that, it's going to help your period, the follicular phase that's about to come back around. It's going to make that be usually a lot lighter. Women report back to me that they have lighter periods, they have less painful periods, they have less cravings during their periods, and they feel less bloating. So in the end, it's about what's doing best for your body. And that's why individual care is so important. So you will see a lot of people out there who say women should never fast. You will also see people out there saying everybody should fast. What I'm encouraging you to do is be considerate of your own body and your own story, and enter into relationship with a healthcare provider, with a clinic, who has your best interest at heart. And that brings us to an end of our time. This has been a lot of fun. Does anybody have any questions before we wrap up our time together? Well, I don't see any questions. So this has been great. And like I said before, I would really encourage you to get with your clinician here at MaxWell Clinic and walk through this with them. And if you want to do fasting, if you want to give this a shot, then I would definitely encourage you to, because fasting can play a pivotal role in changing your longevity and your health in the future. Oh, looks like I got one question. Let me check it out. So it says, I am a 66-year-old postmenopausal woman with Hashimoto's. I used to fast 3 days a month when I was younger and menstruating, but I began to spot between periods due to fasting. May I fast now for 3 days? So that is a wonderful question. And I think it goes right back to the point that we made about how you have to be so careful when you're fasting, especially premenopausal. So being a postmenopausal woman does mean that there's more resiliency, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you're having your labs looked at and you're making that decision with your clinician. And oh, yes. So you were saying it was a 3-day water fast. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, a 3-day water fast is very hard on the body. And yes, so we have a just sort of a shout out about yoga. Yoga is excellent for balancing our hormones, and it definitely would be helpful to be doing yoga when you first introduce fasting to your routine. All right, I hope everybody has a wonderful evening, and I look forward to seeing you in the clinic soon. Bye.